Good morning. Welcome back. We are glad to have our choirs back with us, and we are, woo! Exactly, you said woo. And we are emerging from a season of, for some of us at least, a slower pace of summer into our next season of a more active cycles of our activity of our program year. This Homecoming Sunday is a time for us to once again reground ourselves as we launch into the busyness of being church through our Bible studies, through our various outreach programs, and through other programming throughout the year. But this morning, right now, we are regrounding ourselves through the words of our gospel reading today, as well as the other readings before us. But we start with grounding ourselves in the trust of God. And the collect that we prayed at the beginning of the service, we prayed together, grant us, O Lord, to trust in you with all our hearts. That's where we start as we launch into this program year, trusting in God with all of our hearts. For many of us, our lives may be into a regular rhythm that feels familiar and good, but for others, life is a bunch of chaos, of hurt, of pain, of trying to put pieces back together in the midst of unimaginable grief and heartache. For some of us, we're excited to be back in the church year, but also tired and not able to do one more thing and feel ourselves saying, I cannot sign up for anything else, just let me come and worship. Wherever you are, we are grounding as a community in our trust in God, with all of our hearts, not just a little bit, with all that we have. We know that we gather in this place as people of God to form a community of Christians who struggle together through good and bad to live into the good news of God's love for us in Jesus Christ. The collect continued, as you always resist the proud who confide in their own strength, so you never forsake those who make their boast of your mercy. As we go through this year, we are reminded this morning to pay attention to what we're grounding our confidence, our pride, and our boasting in. Is it in God's mercy, God's grace, or is it in our own sense of accomplishment, our own sense of competence, our own sense of how great we are? Because the thing is, when we ground ourselves in our own strength, then when we inevitably stumble and fall short, we find ourselves reeling. But when we ground ourselves in that trust of God and make our boast of God's mercy, we know that God's love picks us up when we fall, dusts us off, and helps us to continue to move forward. We know that with God's love, when we break relationship with each other, we are able to maybe find a path towards reconciliation. If we rely on our own strength, we're all going to be really weary really fast. But with God's grace and mercy, each of us is able to show up in whatever way we can and participate and strengthen this community with whatever we have in that moment. Perhaps right now you just need to be filled, and showing up is all you can do. You still matter to us in this community. Perhaps you're in a season where you can step in and you're ready to go full of ideas. We need your ideas, your strength, and your energy. You are important in this community. No matter what part of your journey you are on, as a community, we trust that God will give us the grace to together weave a tapestry of community that shows forth in the world a bright light of God's love. But it's not just the what of what we do, but how we do it and the framework in which we operate. When we look at our reading from Romans, and particularly that first part, just that first part that says, owe no one anything except to love one another. The framework in which we operate this coming year has to be grounded in that love of one another. See, in the community that Paul was writing to, the Roman culture, it was one of obligation. There were explicit, but mostly implicit understandings of who you had obligations to based on your class status, based on your education status, based on your cultural status. There were systems and tiers of obligation based on power and authority. One writer described it as a culture of obligation. And then that writer goes on to say, in Paul's writing this letter, and particularly this section, in telling them to owe nothing but love, Paul is turning on its head that culture of obligation into a culture of relationship, a culture of love. Because love indeed is about being in relationship one with another. Paul was seeking to transform them from a culture of obligation to a culture of relational interdependence. Now, please hear me. Relational interdependence doesn't mean that we are not responsible and accountable to one another, but it's grounded in love and not obligation, and those can feel very different. There's a whole lot of difference between, oh, goodness, I haven't called my great aunt in like 6 months. I guess I should pick up the phone and call her, to, oh man, I haven't called my great aunt in 6 months. I want to make sure she's okay, and making that phone call. Obligation versus love. And the reality is that sometimes, even when we are operating out of love, we slip back into obligation. None of us are perfect. But how do we notice? What can we pay attention to? What gets in our way of maintaining that culture of relational interdependence? And as I was thinking about that this week, what came to mind was some work by Brené Brown, who is an Episcopalian and is a sociology researcher. And she talks about the problem of stealth expectations in building strong, vulnerable, authentic relationships. She says that unexamined and unexpressed expectations, which is what she calls stealth expectations, almost always lead to intense, sometimes painful disappointment, with hurt and anger coming right alongside it. Stealth expectations are a setup for the one holding the expectation and the one involved, even if it's just in that person's head. That's a whole lot of words, but one concrete example of how stealth expectations can show up and steal the joy from everybody is on vacation, on Sunday night, I wanted a funnel cake, right? And someone asked me after 8 o'clock, I'm like, you don't know what a funnel cake is? Oh my goodness. So it's fried dough with powdered sugar on top. It's sugar on top of sugar on top of sugar. And it's on the boardwalk and oftentimes in fairs. Anyway, for the past couple of years, we've gotten funnel cake on Sunday night. So I didn't say anything. In my head, I was like, okay, we're gonna get funnel cake tonight, we're gonna get funnel cake. And as the night went on, it was too late to go onto the boardwalk. And I was in a bit of a foul mood. And Kristen was like, what's wrong with you? Why are you in a foul mood? I'm like, we didn't go get funnel cake. We always get funnel cake on the first Sunday of vacation. And she was like, we do? I didn't realize that. I mean, if you wanted funnel cake, why didn't you just say so? And we could have gone to get it. I didn't say anything because I was holding a stealth expectation. In my mind, of course we always get funnel cake on Sundays, but for Kristen, that was not a pattern that was expressed, that was agreed to, and that was something that was communicated. So I was mad, Kristen was annoyed, and nobody had funnel cake. Now that's a small example, but in our relationships, in our individual lives, in our families, and in our church, stealth expectations show up and rob us of the ability to form relationship through vulnerability. Because indeed, it is a vulnerable experience to put out your hopes and dreams, to say, you know what I've always wished we could do? What if we, with the chance that perhaps others will say no, or disregard it, or ridicule you? It is an act of courage and vulnerability to express your expectations clearly so that mutual accountability and responsibility can be expressed. It is vulnerable and scary, but it is the only way that we will be able to continue forward in this place in a way that shows forth the light, the joy that God has given to each one of us. As we ground ourselves in relational interdependence, we have to be willing to take the risk of being seen and known. You'll hear more about this next week as we begin an invitation to a season of listening, which starts with just saying yes to a conversation. Saying yes to a conversation where you're willing to share a little bit of your heart and hear from the other person, just a little bit. The beginning of this relational interdependence is not the continuing growth of this relational interdependence. It's not something that will happen overnight. And we will sometimes, as a community, fall back into obligation instead of love. But we are grounded and reminded that at the core, what we do together is out of love. We owe nothing to each other except to love one another as Christ has loved us. And as we ground ourselves in the trust of God and ground ourselves in interdependent relationship, we can be grounded in right now. The text in Romans goes on to say, besides this, you know what time it is, how it is now the moment for you to wake up from sleep. Right now, when you look around, what do you see? What do you hear? It's often an exercise in trauma therapy to have the people stop and just name what they see around them, to help them ground in where they are right now. As we are grounded in right now, we are then free to see anew what we've always seen and perhaps looked over. When we are grounded in right now, we are able to hear perhaps the sounds of the birds that we've never noticed before. When we are grounded in right now and looking and listening and feeling what's happening right now, we then see the possibilities for what might come, and we open up ourselves to let our light shine even brighter. As we gathered this morning for Homecoming Sunday and launch into our program year, I am really excited and full of joy for us to continue as the community of Trinity to let our light shine in the world. As we move into our program year, may we start this year with an attitude of joy, of celebration, and thanksgiving. Let us pray. Accept, O Lord, our thanks and praise for all that you have done for us. We thank you for the splendor of the whole creation, for the beauty of this world, and for the wonder of life, and for the mystery of your love. We thank you for the blessing of family and friends, and for the loving care which surrounds us on every side. We thank you for setting us at tasks which demand our best efforts, and for leading us to accomplishments which satisfy and delight us. We thank you also for those disappointments and failures that lead us to acknowledge our dependence on you alone. Above all, we thank you for your Son, Jesus Christ, for the truth of his word and the example of his life, for his steadfast obedience by which he overcame temptation, for his dying through which he overcame death, and for his rising to life again, in which we are raised to the life of your kingdom. Grant us the gift of your Spirit, that we may know Christ and make him known, and through him, at all times and in all places, may give thanks to you in all things. Amen.